Are you jealous? The question didn't belong to the moment, and maybe that was why it stayed, hanging in the air long after the elevator door slid shut. But that came later, because the first thing Elizabeth Carter noticed wasn't the voice. It was the feeling, the small, unfamiliar tension that crept in quietly as she stood on her high-rise balcony the night before, her phone buzzing against the glass table, screen lighting up again and again with names that mattered, decisions that couldn't wait, numbers that defined entire quarters. Yet for some reason she let it ring, her attention pulled downward instead, toward the dimly lit parking lot where Marcus Reed stepped out of his old sedan, calm as always, shoulders steady, movements unhurried, a man who never seemed to carry the weight the world tried to place on him. And then she saw her, a girl, young, maybe late teens, stepping out from the passenger side, hesitating for just half a second before following him. And something about that pause, that slight uncertainty, caught in Elizabeth's mind in a way she couldn't immediately explain, her fingers tightening just slightly around the edge of her glass as she watched them walk toward the building entrance. Marcus holding the door open without looking back, the girl slipping inside quietly. No laughter, no closeness, no sign of what Elizabeth had expected and yet somehow still assumed. And that was the part that unsettled her. Not what she saw, but what she didn't, because it would have been easier if it matched the story her mind was already beginning to write. A simpler version of events that required no further thought, no lingering curiosity, just a quiet dismissal filed away under predictable human behavior. But Marcus had never quite fit into categories that easily. Not since the first time she'd noticed him weeks ago in the same elevator, holding his daughter's backpack in one hand, a cup of black coffee in the other, nodding politely without trying to impress, without trying to be seen. And now this unexpected detail that didn't align, didn't resolve, didn't give her the clean conclusion she preferred. And still her phone kept buzzing, insistent, demanding. The world she controlled calling her back. But she let it ring one more time, just one more, as the building door closed behind them and the parking lot fell still. Again, as if nothing had happened at all. Except something had, something small and quiet, and just enough to follow her into the night, into the silence of her penthouse, into the elevator the next morning where the air felt different for no clear reason, where Marcus stood beside her once again, the same calm presence, the same measured breath, and Elizabeth, who negotiated million-dollar decisions without hesitation, found herself watching the reflection of a man she didn't fully understand, and wondering, not why he brought a girl home, but why it mattered that she noticed. The elevator ride felt longer than it should have, not because of distance, but because of the silence that settled between them, the kind that did not ask for attention yet refused to be ignored. And Elizabeth Carter, who was used to filling rooms with decisions and direction, found herself standing still, watching the digital numbers climb one floor at a time, while Marcus Reed stood beside her with the same quiet presence, his posture relaxed, one hand resting lightly on the strap of his daughter's small backpack, as if the weight of it meant something more than what it carried. And she noticed how he did not check his phone, did not shift impatiently, did not try to acknowledge her reflection in the mirrored wall. He simply stood there, grounded, as though time moved differently around him. And that difference unsettled her more than she expected, because it left space for thoughts she did not plan to have, questions she did not intend to ask. And before she could stop herself, her voice broke the silence, measured, controlled, but carrying an edge she could not quite disguise when she said she had not realized he had company the night before. The words chosen carefully, neutral enough to pass as casual, yet deliberate enough to test something unspoken. And Marcus turned his head slightly, not surprised, not defensive, just aware, his eyes meeting hers for a brief second before he gave a small nod, the kind that acknowledged the statement without expanding on it, without offering explanation or invitation. And that was it. No elaboration, no correction, just a quiet acceptance of her observation, which should have been enough, should have closed the moment. But instead it left something unfinished, something hanging between them as the elevator slowed and the doors opened, and Elizabeth stepped out first, heels clicking against the polished floor, expecting the conversation to dissolve behind her. Yet it followed, not in words but in the absence of them, in the way Marcus did not rush past her, did not linger either, simply walked beside her for a few steps before turning in a different direction, his routine uninterrupted, his composure unchanged. And she realized then that what unsettled her was not what she had seen the night before, but the fact that he did not feel the need to explain it, did not feel the pressure to shape her perception, as if her assumptions held no weight in his world, and that absence of reaction created a quiet friction she could not easily dismiss, because she was used to influence, used to presence, used to people adjusting, clarifying, proving, and yet Marcus did none of those things, and as she reached her office, the glass walls reflecting the city stretching endlessly beyond, her phone already lighting up again with urgency, she paused for just a second longer than necessary, her mind returning to a detail she could not fully place. The way the girl had stepped out of the car, not close to him, not distant either, just uncertain, and the way Marcus had held the door without looking back, trusting she would follow, and for reasons she could not yet explain, that small, quiet moment stayed with her, resisting every attempt to reduce it into something simple, something easy, something she could file away and forget, and instead it lingered, patient, waiting, as if it knew she would come back to it whether she wanted to or not. By mid-afternoon, the city had settled into its usual rhythm of urgency, the kind that pressed against the windows of Elizabeth Carter's office without ever truly entering, a constant motion of deals, deadlines, and decisions that required her attention, and normally, she moved through it with precision, her focus sharp, her time accounted for down to the minute. Yet today there was a subtle fracture in that rhythm, something small but persistent that kept pulling her thoughts away from the numbers on her screen and back to a moment that refused to simplify itself. And she did not like unresolved things. She did not like details that lingered without definition. So she did what she always did when something did not make sense, she observed, not directly, not obviously, but with the quiet calculation she had built her career on. And that was how she found herself noticing Marcus again later that day, not in passing, not in coincidence, but in pattern, because patterns revealed truth in ways words often did not. And what she saw did not align with the version of him she had almost allowed herself to accept. He left work at the same time, not late, not early, consistent. He stopped by the small grocery store, across the street, not rushing, choosing items with care, fresh vegetables, simple things, nothing extravagant, nothing careless. And when he returned to the building, his daughter was with him, walking close but not clinging, talking softly while he listened, really listened, the kind of attention that could not be faked, and Elizabeth stood across the street for a moment longer than necessary, her car waiting, her driver glancing at her through the rearview mirror, unsure whether to ask, but she did not move, not yet, because something about the scene resisted the conclusion she had already begun to form. And then, as if the day itself decided to answer her unspoken question without explanation, she saw the girl again, the same one from the night before, standing just inside the building entrance, her posture uncertain, her hands tucked into the sleeves of an oversized hoodie, not scrolling through a phone, not distracted, just waiting. And when Marcus and his daughter approached, there was no sudden shift, no performance, no attempt to hide or redefine the moment. He simply opened the door again, the same way he had the night before, steady, without hesitation, and the girl stepped forward quietly, offering a small nod that was almost easy to miss, and his daughter smiled at her, not curious, not surprised, just familiar, as if this was not new, as if this had already been understood in a way Elizabeth had not yet reached. And that was when the first real crack appeared. In her assumption, not because she had been proven wrong, but because the pieces no longer fit together cleanly, because whatever story she had started to believe lacked something essential, something human that could not be reduced to a single glance from a balcony. And for the first time that day, Elizabeth felt something shift, not in certainty, but in doubt, a quiet, unwelcome awareness that she might have seen only the surface of something deeper, and that realization did not resolve her curiosity. It sharpened it, pulling her further in, because now she was no longer observing to confirm what she thought she knew. She was watching because she needed to understand what she did not. That evening carried a different kind of weight, the kind that did not come from pressure or deadlines, but from a quiet decision forming beneath the surface. And Elizabeth Carter was not someone who followed impulses without reason. Yet she found herself stepping out of her car earlier than usual, dismissing her driver with a brief nod as she chose to walk the remaining distance to the building, her heels softer against the pavement this time, her pace unhurried, as if she were giving the moment space to unfold rather than controlling it. And when she reached the entrance, she did not go inside immediately. Instead, she paused just beyond the glass doors, close enough to see without being seen, close enough to observe without interrupting, and inside, the lobby was calm, the late afternoon light stretching across the floor in long, quiet lines, and there they were again, not positioned for attention, not arranged in any deliberate way, just existing in a small, ordinary moment that somehow carried more weight than it should have. Marcus stood near the seating area, one hand resting lightly on the back of a chair, his daughter beside him, her backpack set down as she spoke about something small, something that made her gesture with quiet excitement. And he listened the same way he always did, steady, present, not distracted by anything beyond that moment. And then the girl was there too, standing a few steps away, not fully inside the circle, yet not outside of it either, her posture still careful, as if she had not yet learned where she was allowed to belong. And Elizabeth noticed the details now, the ones she had missed before, the way the girl did not interrupt, the way she watched before moving, the way her hands remained tucked into her sleeves even though the lobby was warm, and Marcus did not rush her, did not call attention to her hesitation. He simply shifted slightly, creating space without announcing it, an invitation without pressure, and, after a few seconds that stretched longer than they should have, the girl stepped closer, not fully confident, but willing, and his daughter turned toward her with an ease that could not be rehearsed, offering a small smile that carried no judgment, no curiosity that needed answers, just acceptance in its simplest form. And Elizabeth felt something in her chest tighten, not from discomfort, but from recognition, because this was not what she had expected to see. There was no secrecy here, no tension, no hidden narrative, waiting to be exposed. Only a quiet rhythm of people adjusting to one another without forcing anything into place. And Marcus reached down, picking up the backpack, then glanced at the girl briefly, not with scrutiny, not with obligation, but with a calm assurance that required no words. And he said something soft, too quiet for Elizabeth to hear, but the effect was immediate. The girl nodded, a small movement, almost hesitant, yet different from before, as if something inside her had shifted, just enough to trust the space she was standing in. And as the three of them moved toward the elevator, unhurried, aligned in a way that felt natural rather than constructed, Elizabeth remained where she was, her hand resting lightly against the cool glass, her reflection faintly visible beside the scene she had been trying to define all day. And for the first time, she did not try to name what she was seeing, she simply watched, allowing the moment to exist without forcing it into a conclusion. And that, more than anything else, was what unsettled her, because it meant she no longer had control over the story she thought she understood, and somewhere in that loss of control, something quieter began to take its place, something that did not demand answers, only attention. The next morning did not offer clarity, only a sharper awareness of everything Elizabeth Carter could no longer ignore, and it followed her into the underground parking garage where the air felt cooler, quieter, removed from the constant pressure of the city above, the kind of place where conversations either did not happen or happened with more honesty than intended. And she spotted Marcus Reed before she reached her car, standing beside his sedan with the trunk open, his movements unhurried. As he adjusted a grocery bag, checking its balance as if small details mattered, as if care was something he practiced even when no one was watching. And for a brief moment, she considered walking past him, letting the questions settle on their own, letting time do what it usually did, soften curiosity into indifference. But something in her resisted that instinct, something steadier, quieter, urging her not to leave this unfinished, and so she stopped, not abruptly, not dramatically, just enough to shift the moment. And when Marcus noticed her, he did not seem surprised. He simply closed the trunk, gently, and turned toward her, his expression unchanged, open but not inviting, calm but not distant. And Elizabeth realized then that whatever this was, it would not be pulled from him. It would only exist if she chose to step into it. And for a second that stretched longer than it should have, she said nothing, the space between them holding the weight of everything unspoken until she finally broke it, her voice even, controlled, but carrying a directness she rarely needed to use, as she said. She saw him the night before, not as an accusation, not as a question, but as a statement that asked for something more, and Marcus held her gaze for a brief moment, not challenging, not avoiding, simply present, and he nodded once, the same quiet acknowledgement as before, and it would have ended there again, another unfinished exchange slipping into silence, if Elizabeth had not taken one step closer, closing the distance just enough to make the moment impossible to dismiss, and this time her words came clearer, more defined. She said she saw him bring a girl home, and the air shifted, not dramatically, but enough to mark the line between observation and implication, and Marcus exhaled softly, not in frustration, not in defense, just a natural breath, as if he were giving the moment exactly what it required and nothing more. And then he looked at her, really looked at her, as if measuring not her words but the space behind them. And when he spoke, his voice was calm, almost gentle, carrying no edge, no need to correct or confront, just a quiet clarity that landed without force when he asked if she was jealous. And the question did not sound like a challenge. It did not sound like humor either. It simply existed, unexpected, precise, and completely out of alignment with the direction she thought this conversation would take. And Elizabeth felt it immediately, the shift, the disruption of control, because in that single moment the focus had moved away from him and toward her, towards something she had not prepared to examine. And for the first time since she had started watching him, she had no immediate response, no structured answer, only silence that felt unfamiliar, and Marcus did not fill it. He did not repeat himself, did not soften the question. He simply waited for a fraction of a second before reaching for his car door, as if the answer, whatever it was, did not belong to him. And as he stepped back into his routine, leaving the moment exactly where it had landed, Elizabeth remained still, her reflection faint against the polished surface of the car beside her, aware of something she could not yet define, something that had shifted not in what she saw, but in how she was being seen. The silence that followed in the parking garage did not feel empty. It felt occupied, as if the question Marcus Reed had left behind was still standing there between them, taking up space neither of them had chosen, but both of them now had to acknowledge. And Elizabeth Carter remained still beside her car, her hand resting lightly on the door handle without opening it, as if movement might disturb something fragile that had just formed. And for the first time in a long time she found herself without a structured response, without a prepared direction, only awareness, sharp and unfamiliar. And Marcus, now seated in his car, but not yet driving away, looked through the windshield for a brief moment, as if giving her the same quiet consideration he gave everything else in his life, not rushing, not interpreting, simply observing. And that patience unsettled her more than any direct challenge could have, because it did not demand anything from her. It only existed, and after a few seconds he started the engine, the soft sound filling the space between them. But even then he did not leave immediately. Instead he waited a moment longer, as if acknowledging that some things were not resolved by motion alone. And then he finally pulled out of the space with the same steady control he always carried, disappearing toward the exit ramp and leaving Elizabeth alone in the cooler stillness of the garage, where the fluorescent lights hummed faintly above her and the polished concrete reflected a version of herself she did not fully recognize. And she exhaled slowly, not because she had reached clarity, but because she had realized she was no longer certain what clarity even meant in this context. And as she finally opened her car door and sat inside, she did not start the engine right away. Instead she remained still, her eyes fixed on the empty space Marcus had occupied just moments before, replaying the question he had asked not as confrontation but as something else entirely, something that had bypassed her defenses without force. And she considered the girl again, the image now sharper in her mind, not as a mystery to be solved, but as a presence she had not yet understood. And for the first time she allowed herself to admit that her attention toward Marcus had shifted without permission, no longer anchored in curiosity alone, but in something more personal, more uncertain, something that made her question not his actions, but her own reactions to them. And that realization lingered with her as she finally started the engine and drove upward toward the city light. carrying with her a silence that no longer felt neutral, because it had begun to change shape into something she could not yet name. By the time evening settled over the city again, Elizabeth Carter had already convinced herself that she would return to her normal rhythm, that the events of the morning would dissolve under the weight of work and routine. But that intention lasted only until she found herself once again in the familiar descent of the elevator into the lower levels of the building, as if her body had made a decision her mind was still negotiating with. And when the doors opened into the lobby, she stepped out. More slowly than usual, her attention no longer divided by urgency, and what she saw immediately pulled her into stillness, because Marcus Reed was there again, not alone, not performing, simply existing in the same quiet way he always did, standing near the seating area with his daughter close by. And the girl was there too. But this time something had changed in the spacing between them, not physically dramatic, but emotionally visible if one paid attention to what silence revealed. And Elizabeth did pay attention now in a way she had not before, because she had learned that the obvious story was never the full one, and she noticed the details first. The way Marcus's daughter was showing something on a small notebook, pointing with careful excitement, while the girl leaned slightly forward, watching with focus rather than hesitation, and Marcus stood just behind them, not directing, not interrupting, only present, as if his role was not to control the moment, but to hold space for it. And Elizabeth remained near the glass entrance longer than she intended, her presence unnoticed, or perhaps simply not acknowledged. And in that distance she was able to observe without interruption, and what she saw was not what she had once assumed, because there was no tension in the group, no hidden discomfort, only a quiet adjustment happening between people who were slowly learning each other's boundaries. And then she heard Marcus speak, his voice low but steady, not carrying authority in the conventional sense, but something softer, something that did not need to be enforced. And he said something that made his daughter nod before stepping slightly closer to the girl, offering the notebook so she could see better, and the girl accepted it carefully, almost as if she was still learning how to receive kindness without hesitation. And that moment lingered longer than it should have in Elizabeth's perception, because it did not fit the narrative she had been constructing, and as she watched, she noticed something else. The girl's attention was not distracted, not performative, but focused on the drawing or writing in front of her, as if it mattered, as if it had been given importance, and Marcus did not interrupt that focus. He simply stood nearby, occasionally adjusting his position so that the light from the ceiling did not cast too harshly across the page, a small gesture that carried no announcement, no expectation of recognition, and Elizabeth felt something subtle shift again, because these were not the actions of secrecy or concealment. These were the actions of stability, of patience, of a kind of responsibility that did not demand visibility. And for the first time she began to consider that what she had interpreted as mystery might actually be simplicity she had not yet learned to recognize. And as she continued to watch from the edge of the lobby, she realized that the question was no longer about who the girl was, but about why she had assumed the worst explanation first. And that realization did not bring resolution, only a deeper pause, as if the story she thought she was observing had quietly turned back toward her and was now asking to be reconsidered. The next morning arrived with a softer kind of light, filtered through the glass towers of the city, but Elizabeth Carter did not feel the usual sense of control that came with it, because something had shifted in the way she approached the day, not in her schedule, which remained precise and demanding, but in her attention, which now seemed less certain of where to land. And as she stepped into the elevator that would take her down to the lobby, she found herself already aware of the possibility that she might see Marcus Reed again, and that awareness alone was enough to unsettle her more than she cared to admit, because anticipation was not something she usually allowed to form without purpose, yet it had formed anyway, quietly, without permission, and when the doors opened, she did not immediately step out, not because she was unsure of her destination, but because she was confirming something she had begun to suspect. And there he was, standing near the entrance as if he had been part of the building's rhythm all along, his daughter beside him, adjusting the strap of her backpack, and the girl was there again. But this time Elizabeth noticed something different before anything else, the absence of hesitation that had marked her earlier presence, as if the space around Marcus had begun to feel more familiar to her. and that realization alone made Elizabeth pause longer than she intended, watching as Marcus's daughter showed something small on her phone, a photograph or a note, something that made her smile in a way that was unguarded and natural, and the girl leaned closer without the careful distance she once kept, and Marcus, as always, remained slightly behind them, not separating himself from the moment, but not controlling it either, and Elizabeth realized that what she was witnessing was not an arrangement, not a performance, but a pattern of trust that repeated itself in small, quiet ways. And as she finally stepped out of the elevator, her presence still unnoticed, she moved closer than before, not enough to interrupt, but enough to observe more clearly, and she heard fragments of conversation, nothing important in isolation, just ordinary words exchanged with ease. And yet the ease itself carried meaning, because it suggested time, repetition, familiarity that could not be manufactured in a single encounter, and she watched as Marcus gently adjusted his daughter's backpack strap, not correcting, not instructing, simply ensuring comfort. And then she noticed the girl speaking directly to Marcus for the first time without waiting, her voice low but steady, and he responded with a simple nod and a brief sentence that seemed to settle something rather than expand it. And in that exchange Elizabeth felt a quiet reversal inside her perception, because what had once appeared uncertain now looked structured, not rigid, but stable, and she found herself reconsidering every assumption she had made about distance and intent, because nothing she was seeing now aligned with the interpretation she had carried before. And as the group finally began moving toward the exit together, unhurried and aligned without effort, Elizabeth remained still for a moment longer, realizing that she was no longer watching to solve a question, but watching to understand a reality that had been unfolding all along without needing her approval. And that realization, subtle but undeniable, left her with a stillness that followed her even as she finally stepped forward into her day. The city looked the same that evening, glass reflections stacking against glass reflections, lights slowly replacing daylight as if nothing had changed. But Elizabeth Carter felt the difference in a way she could not ignore anymore, because it was no longer about what she had seen, it was about what she had stopped assuming. And as she stepped out of her car and approached the building, she did not rush, she did not calculate. She simply moved forward with a quiet awareness that had replaced her usual certainty. And when she entered the lobby, she already knew before she saw him that Marcus Reed would be there, not because of prediction, but because her perception had shifted into recognition, and he was there exactly as expected, standing with his daughter and the girl beside them, not as a moment that demanded interpretation anymore, but as a moment that existed on its own terms. And this time Elizabeth did not stay at a distance. She walked forward, not interrupting, but not hiding either. And as she came closer, Marcus noticed her, not with surprise, but with the same calm acknowledgement he gave everything. And for a brief second there was silence between them, not heavy, not tense, just present. And Elizabeth realized that this silence no longer felt like something unresolved, but something complete in itself. And she looked at the girl, really looked, not searching for answers anymore, but seeing what was already visible, a quiet presence that no longer carried uncertainty. And Marcus's daughter stood beside her, speaking softly about something on a small page she was holding, and the girl listened without hesitation now. Her posture relaxed in a way that suggested she had stopped measuring every moment for risk, and Marcus, standing slightly behind them as always, did not explain anything, because there was nothing left to explain. And when he finally spoke, it was only to his daughter, a simple sentence that carried warmth without effort, and Elizabeth felt something settle inside her, not as realization arriving suddenly, but as misunderstanding finally loosening its grip. And in that clarity she understood that nothing she had witnessed was ever hidden, it had only been unfamiliar to her perspective. And as the group slowly began to move toward the exit, she did not follow immediately, she watched instead, allowing herself to see without framing. And when Marcus passed by her, their eyes met briefly, not as confrontation, not as confirmation, but as acknowledgement, and there was no question left between them now. Only a quiet understanding that people are not defined by the first story written about them. And as they disappeared into the rhythm of the city together, Elizabeth remained for a moment longer in the stillness of the lobby, no longer trying to interpret what she had seen, only accepting that sometimes understanding arrives not through answers, but through the simple act of finally seeing clearly.